Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you also for the invitation and for all the arrangements you've made. Made it a very, very enjoyable first visit for me to Armenia, and thanks also to the AUA Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs for their support. So I'd never been to Armenia before, and so it's been a huge learning experience. And I did a little bit of historical. I read a couple of historical accounts of the recent past. I never got back to 301, unfortunately. So I completely this is news. This was completely news, and so the talk was drafted and sent for translation purposes in advance of the conference. And now I think, coming right at the end, if I was now writing it afresh, I would give it probably quite a different focus, address a slightly different set of issues. But there we are. We have to. So in what way? Well, so I've learned a huge amount about national identity in Armenia through the conference and through conversations with people around and outside and so on. And it's a strange experience because some of the issues that people talk about, like territory and borders and church and state, most of these issues I've written about elsewhere, these are very familiar issues that come up in discussions of national identity. But then there are all kinds of other issues, for example, race, ethnicity, religious difference, gender, sexuality, immigration, all of these issues which, if I were giving a talk on national identity in the UK or probably in most European countries, people will be jumping up and down. What about race? What about immigration? What about women? But so what do I conclude? Well, I think I conclude that these are probably good problems to have. If you're in a condition where your national identity is such that you can begin arguing about issues of ethnicity and gender and so on in relation to it, it probably shows you're in a fairly secure place. And this is a different situation. So what I'm trying to do in the paper, at a fairly general level, is to provide a kind of normative stock-taking of the whole idea of nationalism and national identity. In other words, asking the very general question, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Now, of course, we can't control that. We can control to some extent the direction it takes. But even so, I think it's worth asking the general question. And so I'm assuming we're just talking about the idea of people having a national identity and organising their political world around it. So you have typically the nation state, sometimes a more elaborate arrangement where you have subnational units having some kind of autonomy, but basically a political arrangement in which the world order is made up of communities defined in terms of national identity. Let's see if we can work this. Yeah. So, the two faces. So, the idea that nationalism is a two-faced phenomenon is not new. And 50 years ago, the Scottish political theorist Tom Nairn wrote a book about the two faces, the Janus-faced phenomenon. Janus is on the right is the Greek god of doors. One face looks in each direction. And for Nairn, writing within a broadly Marxist tradition, one face of nationalism was forward-looking, associated with anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, while the other was backward-looking, associated with imperialism and fascism. Now, I'm less confident than Nairn was that we know which direction history is moving in, so I can't use the sort of progressive reactionary way of distinguishing the two faces. But I'm going to try to instead contrast some of the morally abhorrent consequences that nationalism can sometimes lead to with, on the other hand, with the beneficial consequences that in favourable circumstances it can create. So I'm trying to draw up a balance sheet. So let's begin with the dark face. So this, in a way, I think will come as no surprise. So nationalism over the last 2 centuries has been a major cause of war. War, of course, is as old as the human species, but nationalist war has a particular character because it involves the mass mobilization of people who are nonetheless willing to fight for national causes. And this also makes nationalist wars, I think, more brutal than the kind of staged mercenary wars of the medieval period. So here's the, on the right is the famous recruiting poster for Britain in World War I, and millions of young men, of course, responded to this request. And of course, and it's not just Europe that's experienced wars based on national rivalries. It's true also of, let's say, India and Pakistan, Iran and Iraq, Vietnam and Cambodia. The list can go on and so on. Now, it's an interesting question why this connection exists. And in part, it seems to me to be a byproduct of the wish on the part of at least certain nations, those that regard themselves as great powers, to dominate those around them. So it's something like a collective version of Rousseau's amour propre, which he applied to individuals. So it results from a failure to recognize the equal standing of other states and willingness to subject them to your power, clearly demonstrated at the present by President Putin's attitude towards Ukraine, which he clearly does not regard as a legitimate state, but as a kind of natural vassal to Russia. And this was the idea, I think, that you find in Hegel's philosophy of right. We had Herder and Fichte yesterday. We're having Hegel as successor today. Hegel clearly has this distinction between advanced civilized nations and the barbarians who can be rightfully dominated and subjugated. Clearly turned out to be justification for colonialism, but also for domination over near neighbours in Europe. But perhaps more commonly, of those, I think the domination motive is important. More commonly, perhaps, nations fight for territory. And as we know only too well, the outer limits of nations as identity groups don't always line up neatly with the borders of states, however these are drawn. There's no way of drawing the state borders in such a way that each simply encapsulates a single nation. And so nationalities are intermingled on the ground, and in some cases, physical sites that are of great symbolic importance, this is going to be familiar to this audience, are located across the border in another state. And this is the pictures of the battlefield site of Gazimestan, where in 1389, Serbian Prince Lazar fought against the invading Turks. And this is now this event is now the most important day in the Serbian national calendar, but the monument is across the border in the Republic of Kosovo. So, wars then have often fought to redraw borders in a way that's favourable to the state that initiates them. And as the author of The War Puzzle points out, it's a peculiarly sensitive matter for human collectivities. So that's what I want to say about the first feature of the dark face of nationalism. The second feature is about the way in which national identities, which are meant to be egalitarian in nature, are often in practice sources of social inequality. So, in principle, nations are egalitarian and inclusive. As a French person or as an Armenian, you think of yourself as an equal to every other French person or Armenian. So, political communities are formed on a national basis, have a different underlying character from more traditional hierarchical, say feudal forms of political organization in which people stand in a vertical relationship to each other. But in practice, despite this, there is differentiation, in particular between those whose membership of the nation comes by birth and ancestry and those who lack such roots. So you can't become fully, on this idea of French, or fully Armenian simply by living in the country, even for an extended period of time. And European languages have expressions whose purpose is to signal the difference between the real national and others. So, for example, true Brit, who's a true Brit. Français de souche, echt Deutsch. These are all ways of separating and so on the right we have some national characters of the true person. It's rather amusing because the English character under a cloud, well, actually, England has been experiencing a drought for about the last 3 months. It hasn't rained. It's a national crisis. But this is not the only way in which this difference between those who are born and those who arrive, it's not the only way in which nations act as a source of inequality, because national identities are always also value-laden, and so they implicitly or explicitly signal what it takes to be a good or worthy member of the nation. So I managed to find a picture of an Armenian monument celebrating the heroes of the First War of Independence. And of course, there can be, it's not entirely homogenous. There can be many different ways of being nationally excellent. You can be a soldier, an artist, scientist, and so on, and the achievements to be recognised can be different sorts. But nonetheless, the effect is to partition people between those who belong to the kinds of favoured groups who are able to fall into these categories of national hero, national achievement, and those that aren't. So, for example, very obviously, if military achievement is celebrated, but women are not thought to be suitable for enlisting in the army, they can just function as stretcher bearers, but nothing much more than that. In this icon, as it were, there appears to be one woman, but I couldn't quite decode what she's supposed to represent. Perhaps somebody will enlighten me afterwards. The one second down on the right-hand side appears to be a female face, but the scarf maybe suggests something interesting. So, we'll think also here about national histories, narratives about the collective past handed down from one generation to the next. So these are going to be modified as time passes, nations' public values change, different episodes are highlighted, and others will be seen in a different and new light. But at any moment, national history also serves as a catalogue of events that show the nation both at its best and at its worst. So part of the function of national history is to teach moral lessons to the new generation. But within that generation, different subgroups are going to stand in different relationships to the national past, some finding it easier than others to identify with the events and those responsible for them. So national histories are predominantly histories of those who belong to the ethnic majority, so white males in the case of European societies, and those are also the people who today is going to find it easiest to identify with the intergenerational community that makes up the nation. Of course, this also involves taking responsibility for national crimes and so forth committed in the past. Or think another important symbolic marker. Think about national flags in historically Christian countries, though I noticed not in Armenia, interestingly, the national flag will often feature a cross. Here are the Nordic flags together, and all of them have crosses. And this is going to have the effect of dividing the population between those who can recognize their own heritage in the flag and those who find it more problematic. Now, in profiling the dark face of nationalism, I'm not suggesting there's nothing that can be done to lighten it. Some countries are now going to great pains to try to correct for the inegalitarian effects of national identity by deliberately recognizing the contributions made by excluded groups. So there are many statues and plaques that are going up in public places to honor the achievements of women and ethnic minorities. And that's all to the good. But whether it can really succeed in erasing the inequality that the national understanding of the past brings with it is, I think, another matter. So I think that if we're going to defend nationalism, it's better to begin by openly acknowledging the dark face before going on to celebrate the light one. So many philosophers would like nationalism to disappear. So Albert Einstein famously described nationalism as an infantile disease, the measles of mankind. And if that's the view you take, then obviously the first thing you want to do is find a vaccine, right? Get rid of it. But that seems unlikely to happen, and now I'm going to try and show why it wouldn't actually be a good thing if national identities were to disappear. So the light face, part one. So here I'm going to have, again, there are going to be two features, two parts of the light face. So first, national identities contribute to the well-being of the nation's members. So the promise of nationalism is it can answer the human need to belong under conditions of modernity, where people no longer live in face-to-face societies where you interact with a small number of people that you know fairly intimately. This, I think, was well brought out in the quotation from Isaiah Berlin that was in Gina's presentation a bit earlier, this idea of the nation as meeting a human need to belong. So under favourable conditions, the nation's a community of people who identify with one another, who are committed to providing one another with security and support. It's also a community that extends backward and forward in time. So having a national identity puts you in a line of descent from significant events in the past, about which you may feel either pride or shame. And at the same time, you're involved in a collective project going ahead to shape the nation's future, for example, in areas like cultural development, environmental protection, and so on and so forth. Now, against this, it's sometimes said that people don't have a need to belong specifically to national communities. They may have a need to belong to a group, but this can be satisfied in many other ways. People have multiple identities. They're workers, they're sports fans, they're members of the church choir, and so on. But I think that national identity plays a special role in people's lives, partly, as I've said, because it places them within the long arc of history, and also because it connects them to a particular place, the nation's homeland. So love of and pride in the beauties of the homeland seem to be a feature of all the national identities I've encountered, clearly Armenia as well. And we can speculate about why this emotional attachment to territory, which, as I said earlier, is also partly responsible for the darker face of nationalism, should be so prominent in human psychology. And again, I think it's important to stress the modernity of nationalism. So whereas territorial attachment seems to be a universal feature of human life, the form it takes within nations is special, in particular because of the historical narrative which explains how the nation has shaped the land while in turn being shaped by it. In other words, nations don't simply live on the land, they're actually intertwined with it historically over time. Now, of course, there are increasing numbers of people in liberal societies who claim to be cosmopolitans, citizens of the earth. But here I'm using a slide from the book that I edited with Gina. There's no sign that levels of national identification are in decline across here a wide range of European and Western societies. So you can see that numbers of people, percentages of people who feel close or very close to their nation are typically 80% or more. And there are one or two minor fluctuations, but on the whole, the picture is of very stable national identification. So the first light feature of nationalism is that nations allow their members to be at home in the world. That's their intrinsic value. But I'm going to talk a bit more about the instrumental value of national identities, particularly their value in supporting democracy. And hope I'm going to be able to move quite quickly over some part of that because it was anticipated in Gina's very enlightening lecture before the break. So, what explains the connection between nationality and stable democracy? I mean, it's evident historically because, as in Europe in particular, as nations freed themselves from the grip of empires, the new regimes that they sought to establish were always democratic, or at least proto-democratic. As I say, that's the logic of nationalism, that people come together as equals. But how is that connection to be explained? Why does stable democracy need the cement that nationality provides? I think there are two reasons at least. The first is that it provides a solution to what philosophers call the democratic boundary problem, the problem of determining the size and shape of the political units within which democratic government will be practiced. So you can't use a democratic procedure to set the boundaries. A democracy can't vote itself into existence because until it exists, nobody knows who's going to form part of the constituency. So there must already be a people who can come together and decide how they're going to be governed. And when consolidated nations exist, groups held together by identity and culture, then they form peoples of that kind. Doesn't mean that the boundary problem's easy to solve in practice, because as I said earlier, there can be cases where peoples are intermingled on the ground, and it's very hard then to work out what the optimum way of drawing borders is. But in principle, it provides a solution. Now, you might say in reply to that, well, look, okay, maybe even if democratic states must first be formed along national lines, once they're formed, the borders are established, boundary problem goes away, then now the people can be defined simply as everybody who resides within the state's borders, regardless of cultural identity. I think Jürgen Habermas has a view roughly of that kind. But this doesn't answer what we can call the Why Switzerland problem, title of Jonathan Steinberg's book. It's an interesting cover. I don't know whether he chose it or whether the publisher did, with the peaceful cow and behind the famous Swiss minarets debate being depicted. Interesting choice of imagery. So this is the problem of why Switzerland should continue to exist as an independent state. Why shouldn't the three main language groups, perhaps even the fourth, transfer their allegiance to France, Germany and Italy? Cantons are already neatly divided up. Wouldn't be difficult to do this. Linguistic lines. So to explain why there should be Switzerland, why Switzerland should continue, which I hope it does, love Switzerland, we need to tell some story about what it is that holds the Swiss people together. So although the historic origins of Switzerland may to some extent be arbitrary, it's not now an arbitrary matter that, let's say, Thurgau should be a Swiss canton rather than a district of Baden-Württemberg. The citizens identify as Swiss and would strongly resist any attempt to change their nationality. So, of course, there's no movement in Switzerland at the moment to break up the country. But in many other places, secessionist groups are trying to take territory from states and create new ones. Some cases, there are going to be good grounds for secession, other cases not. But I think you can't address this question of when a secession is justified from a democratic state without asking the question about national identity and whether the seceding group has an identity that's sufficiently distinct and consolidated to justify the demand for a secession. But this is not the connection with the boundary issue is not the only reason why nationalism and democracy go together. It's also relevant to whether democracy can operate successfully. So democracy is not a machine. Of course, it has institutions, it has procedures for making decisions, electing people to office and so on, but it still relies on individual people being willing to use those institutions and follow the procedures in the way that was intended. So when democracies decay or collapse, it's often because powerful people choose to ignore legislative or judicial decisions or rig elections, or just simply refuse to accept the results once these are declared. So politics is a game played for high stakes. Citizens are often passionate in holding diametrically opposed views on the issues of the day. And so there has to be an ethos that restrains individual ambition, encourages people to work together for common ends, even if this means compromising some of their most cherished aims. So citizens have to view one another not as enemies, but as collaborators who are engaged in a collective project and can in principle be persuaded to change their minds through deliberation when a resolution of some problem is needed. Now, in particular, I think it's important, and this may be an issue which is one of the issues that may not appear in quite the same way in Armenia. It's important that democracies have to use the majority principle to make decisions. There's no other way of making them. But it should try to temper that with respect for majority rights. And so it requires majorities to exercise democratic self-restraint by not pushing through policies that are known to be injurious or offensive to significant minority groups. So, for example, it shouldn't prohibit the wearing of forms of dress that the majority may take some exception to. So, again, the question is what can motivate citizens and their representatives to take account of the interests of the minority who they oppose on the issues of the day. And claim is that this minority has to be seen as compatriots, people with whom we share a great deal in common, even though on this particular occasion we now find ourselves in disagreement. So if we think of them as collaborators and compatriots, we're not going to want to impose upon them decisions that they find repugnant. So here, just a brief word on the relationship between nationalism and populism, since often these two in the popular imagination get conflated. So populism, it's hard to define, but I think the characteristic feature, whether it's of the left or the right, is that populists claim to be representing the mass of real people against the parasitic elite who are currently governing and exploiting them. So it has a majoritarian character, but it's also essentially exclusive and divisive because the populist leader positions himself as the people's champion while demonizing those who oppose him as the people's internal enemies. And this as a result, makes it anti-pluralistic, doesn't recognise the way in which societies are made up of many subgroups with different interests and convictions. So although populists may just use nationalist rhetoric, theirs is actually a distorted version of nationalism that not only represents an over-homogenised view of the people, but also abandons the inclusive aims of the democratic form of nationalism that I'm presenting here. So inclusive nationalists have no wish to invent internal enemies. On the contrary, they regard it as failure of nation building if there's a section of the community that continues to pursue its own interests at the expense of the whole. So the question then is how this essential trust in fellow citizens can be produced. And here's, as I say, I can abbreviate my remarks because Gina gave us a very eloquent account of the sets of experiments which have shown the way in which identification leads to, broadly speaking, altruistic behaviour towards collaborators and the willingness to contribute to various kinds of common goods by, for example, donating resources into common pools. And some of these, like the picture experiment that she showed us, have nothing to do with national identity specifically, but some of the experiments are specifically targeted towards national identity. And this is just on the right here is one of the ones that she mentioned, an experiment carried out in India where the participants were asked about whether they're willing to devote aid and resources to help somebody who comes from what the other community. In other words, Hindus and Muslims are being the two relevant communities. Are you willing to contribute some money to help the other community? And the difference is that the India with its national flag shown top left corner is present in some of the participants, and for the control group there's no such stimulus. So that's an example of the kind of national identity experiment that is used to demonstrate the trust element. So now it's obviously important that the trust boosting effects depend upon the identity that's being made salient being an inclusive one, so that it's important that people should recognise, this is particularly the case, I think, in the other experiment in Malawi, where there are two ethnic groups. And it's very important that the Malawian flag that's being shown is thought to be an inclusive symbol. So the extent to which national identities are formed in the image of the majority, especially the ethnic majority, they're not only inegalitarian by virtue of consigning those outside of the majority to second-class status, but they're also unable to perform this trust-building function because the stimulus won't have the desired effect on those outside the majority. So whether nationalism shows mainly its light face or its dark face is going to depend on how national identity is constructed. So talk about construction doesn't mean this is a self-conscious act of a particular generation. So national identities are not only inherited, but they have a prominent historical component. They require historical memory and remembering. And we've had the famous quotation from Renan a couple of times already. They also may require historical forgetting, but they're always in the process of being remade fragment by fragment, where national ceremonies are recast to be more inclusive. Now, if you watch a coronation of a British monarch, you'll see representatives of minority religions are given some role, not the main role, but they're there nonetheless in supporting characters. Some cases, flags are redesigned so that they are thought to become more inclusive. School textbooks are being rewritten so that different episodes of the national past are highlighted and contributions of minorities are emphasised. And so there are always going to be choices to be made. The choice effectively, first of all, whether as a people we should try to dominate our neighbours or live with them on terms of equality. Should we assert territorial rights aggressively or look for compromises in disputed areas, such as forms of power sharing, for example, very important, I think, to solve some of these problems? And should we define ourselves as a nation on the basis of ethnic or cultural identities that only some of us can share, or should we try to develop a national culture and identity that's accessible to everyone, though without obliterating everything that makes us distinctive? So I think this is the conclusion. Back to Janus, the light face and the dark face. So I've juxtaposed nationalism's dark face as a leading driver of international conflicts and as a potential source of social inequality, with the light face as a means of locating us in time and space under conditions of modernity and generating the social and political trust that a liberal democracy needs to function properly. So rather than taking stand for or against national identities, as in the case of Einstein, I think we should ask, how can they be shaped so that the light face is turned towards us and the dark face is turned away? Thank you.
I think all of us would have liked to hear the paper that David thinks he might have given after hearing other talks here. But I think what went on in this paper, the two faces, the Janus faces of nationalism, speaks to many of the problems that we currently have in Armenia. So thank you very much, David. Thank you indeed for the depth of your thinking. Unfortunately, we have time only for two questions. Okay, I see an unfamiliar hand there, which is very good. Great. So would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. So I'm Shushan, and thank you very much for this very enlightening lecture. So my question is about the possibility of having international democracy with nationalism. Thinking about the current EU Parliament and, for example, the previous cycle of elections in the Europe zone, now we have lots of political parties who define their interests as supporting their own national interests, but at the same time going to the European Parliament, we see that these national interests sometimes go against democratic interests of what we see as liberal world. So I wanna understand how you would combine democratic liberalism with nationalism, considering the political scope that we have now, the political reality we have now.
Thank you. Yes, really good question. Of course, coming from the UK, I'm not in a very good position to talk about European democracy. I do think, Europe functions quite effectively in certain areas, but I think the European Parliament is probably the least important of the institutions. I think the Commission and the Council of Ministers are actually far more important. And these really serve as forums within which the various component nations negotiate their mutual interests and so on. And the European democracy the Parliament has a kind of legitimating function, but I think it's not really an effective democratic institution. And I think I would, in general, be skeptical about whether you can have strong forms of democracy above the nation state. I think, in fact, that the most successful democracies are actually quite small. So the big countries like the US have a very, I would say, feeble and corrupt version of democracy compared to a small country like, let's say, Denmark or Iceland, for example. Very small, super democratic, very deliberative, and in some ways a kind of model of what can be achieved in a small nation. So I think there's a size problem, but there's also a problem about the degree of diversity that enables a democracy to function. If it's to be more than just a mechanism for sort of brokering agreements between people who have different interests, if it's to be truly a kind of deliberative decision-making body, I think it has to be kept largely within national boundaries.
Thank you, Professor, for this enlightening lecture. My question is on the definitional content of identity. And this draws from your lecture as well as the previous lecture. I think Akhil Bilgrami on identity has asserted that, in a way, that if push comes to shove, what fundamental commitments to desires, which can be conscious or unconscious, will one resort to as a matter of existential choice would reveal the person's identity, which is that what are our commitments to desires where not being able to fulfill those would seem as a betrayal to the self. So my question is, in our discussion on national identity, especially liberal nationalism, are we collapsing the distinction between, say, national mood or beliefs or national identification and national self to talk about national identity in a broad sense? As I think the difference is in the depth of these commitments to the desires of the people or the demos. So my question is this: can there ever be a fundamental and existential commitment to liberal nationalism as, say, opposed to a religious nationalist? Can the commitment to those desires of being a liberal nationalist be that deep in comparison to other kinds of nationalism? Thank you.
Thank you. A very interesting question. I think it, to some extent, also relates to the previous keynote, which is about the way in which liberal nationalists think of people as holding their identities. And so I think, if your question is whether a liberal nationalism can replicate the kind of fervour that you find in religious forms of nationalism, well, the answer is probably not, right? But then, isn't that a good thing, right? Isn't it a good thing that a liberal nationalism is going to be a fairly mild, a fairly self-reflective, maybe to some extent ironic form of nationalism? So, in my since Gina very kindly put up the cover of my original book on nationality, inside that, one of my first quotations was from a novel, but it was about a Scot, and what it said was that he was a man who loved his country, who grasped its traditions and responded in an emotional way to its traditions, and wanted to pass them on to his children. But at the same time, he could recognise the elements of contrivance and artificiality and so on. Scots love their kilts, but in fact the kilt was a 19th century invention. The clans were kind of constructed in an artificial way in the 19th century. So you can know that at one level, but at the same time you can love to hear the bagpipes and you can admire the kilt and so on and so on. So I think this is very characteristic of a liberal national identity, that you, at one level, you adhere to certain beliefs and so on, but you also recognise the contingency and, to some extent, the artificiality, and you can laugh at yourself. As you wave the flag, you can also be laughing at yourself at the same time. And this is very important because it's what prevents the dark face from dominating.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you so much for this talk.